look at some construction techniques. I like to show you the construction techniques as you see them in ready-to-wear before we actually do them, so you'll have something to refer back to in your mind as you're making your samples. The first construction technique that I want to show you is the intersecting seam. You see an intersecting seam where two things come together, two pieces. So, for example, the two legs of the pants come together and they'll make an intersecting seam. You can think of it as a four-way stop. You see it in the sleeve and the blouse where the armhole and the sleeve come together and they'll make, again, like a four-way stop. So it's an intersecting seam, and it's important that they all line up together at right angles. So that's the intersecting seam. A seam with ease is the next thing that we'll look at, and that's where you've got a bigger, slightly bigger piece of fabric that you're trying to make fit to a smaller piece of fabric. So you see that in this blouse. So the sleeve, the head of the sleeve was probably just slightly bigger than the opening of the armhole. So they did a row of stitches and then they shrunk it down to fit. And what you see are these little bitty ripples or not puckers, but just little ripples. And so you know that this was a bigger piece of fabric to stitch into a smaller opening. Seam with ease is just a slightly different, or very different than gathers. So gathers, again, are the same concept, but it's a much bigger piece of fabric that you're shrinking down to fit a smaller piece of fabric. We'll look at that in the skirt that has a gathered waist. And so the skirt, that you had this much fabric twice, trying to scrunch it down to fit onto this waistband. And so we ran 2 rows of gathering threads, and it's very full, and it's taking a big piece of fabric and shrinking it down to fit a smaller piece of fabric on this waistband. So this is gathered a little bit different than the seam with ease that we just looked at. We'll look at some curves. So concave and convex. Convex is like the outside shape of your eye. I have to really think about that. So a convex curve you would see on the bottom edge of a pocket. So this right here would be a convex curve. You would see it in the curve of this jacket, the curved edge of the jacket right there. So you want to stitch those carefully, and then you'll clip them to reduce the bulk. So you see how this is a nice smooth edge, and that tells you that they have clipped out all the bulky seam allowance so that it laid flat, nice and smooth like that. So that's a convex curve. A concave curve you're going to see in a neckline. So in a scoop neckline, or let's see, this blouse has kind of a concave curve to it. Concave curve. So like going into a cave. So this curve was sewn, and it was also clipped, and you can actually see the little clip marks through the fabric because it's sheer. It was clipped to allow the curve to lie flat, and then on the inside you'll notice that it was understitched, and the understitching prevents this facing piece from rolling out to the front or coming to the top. Where you can see what I'm talking about is on this convex curve, how the facing has rolled forward and come out from behind, and you can see it. Instead of a nice clean edge like you see down here, you can see that the under fabric has rolled forward to the front, and so that's why we understitch on a concave curve. And then the last thing I want to show you are darts, and you see darts everywhere. Here are 2 darts in the back of the neckline that will help the fabric curve over your shoulder. So you have a slight curve on that part of your body. You have a curve at your waist, and so you'll see darts in the edge of this skirt, the waistline of the skirt. And then there's always the bust dart, and you can see that right here on this dress. There's a bust dart that comes from the side seam up to go over the curve of the bust. So that's the dart. And those are the construction techniques that we'll be doing as samples. Next, we're going to look at the intersecting seam, and that's what the finished product will look like. You're going to start with two of your squares, and you're going to sew a 5/8 inch straight 5/8 inch seam down through there, and then we'll press this open. I've already done that, but then we would take this and press this seam allowance open flat like that. So we'll pretend like we press that open. You'll do that for two squares. So you'll end up with four squares sewn together. So we've got 2 and 2. And we're going to put these together to make the intersecting seam. What we want to do is lay them on top of each other with the right sides together, the outside sides. And then you want to take your pins and you want to make sure that these two seams are right on top of each other. So we're going to line them up there. They look like they're right on top of each other. And then we're going to put a pin in the seam allowance like that, and then a couple more on down. So there and on this side. All right, so again, it looks like they're right on top of each other, and we're ready to go. So now what we'll do is just a straight 5/8 inch seam to connect these two parts. So you're going to line it up on 5/8 and go down here. All right, so here we go. Pull the pin out right before you get to it. Undo it. They are, for the most part, right on top of each other. Then you would want to press this open on this side. And that would give you your, just like a four-way stop, your intersecting seam. And it looks like it's a smidge bit off, but you've got the idea. Our next seam is the seam with ease. It's a little bit different than the gathered seam that we'll do in a minute, but I wanted to show you that when you do a seam with ease, there is a little bit of puckering or waviness to the seam, but a lot of times this will press out, and we can look at that in a minute. But what happens is, for different reasons, one piece of fabric will be just a little bit shorter than the other piece of fabric, and you'll need to stretch it to make it fit. And like I say, this helps it curve. You might see this on a shoulder or a waistline. You might see it over the bust, but it creates the curve that helps the fabric go over the curve of the body. So for our sample, we're going to start with one square, and you can usually work in between 1/4 and a half of an inch. So we're going to trim off about 1/2 inch off of one side of the square and ease that in. So we've got our two squares here, and let's see, we'll put them together. We want to find the middle of the shorter one, and we'll pin it to the middle so we have the even amount on the left and the right, and we'll put a pin right in the middle. Then we want to pin these two edges so that they line up perfectly. So this is the amount that we're going to ease in to the left or to the right, and then this is the amount that we're going to ease in to the left. So we've got our 3 pins and our, all right, so we'll do a 5/8 inch seam just like before. We're on straight stitch and 5/8 inch, and then the standard seam length, stitch length. What you want to remember to do is put the bigger piece of fabric to the bottom and hold and the smaller piece of fabric on top. What's going to happen is the machine, as it goes, the feed is going to pull the extra fabric through the machine faster than the top. And I'll show you how that'll work. So we're going to line it up on the 5/8 inch stitch length, and we're going to hold this top piece with our fingers and leave the bottom to be worked in. So we're tugging on it just slightly, but we're allowing the machine to work the extra fabric into the stitch. So here we go. Now I'm going to hold down here on this end, and back stitch is always a good thing to do. I forget from time to time. Then we're going to trim off our extra threads. Let's see how it ended. All right. So yes, perfect. So here we got, again, this just a little bit of ripples or not puckers. You don't want puckers. You don't want distinct folds. You want it to be ever so slightly eased in like that. And then, like I say, we could press this and it might mold it a little bit. We would lay it over the pressing hand and it would mold it and make it a curve that would go over, let's say, your shoulder. So this is the Seam with Ease. For the gathered seam sample, you're going to start with 2 pieces of fabric. You want one that's longer. I think this is 18 inches by 6 inches, and then your normal square. The first thing to think about when you're doing the gathered sample is finding the middle of both pieces. So I folded it in half, and I've made a little clip in the center of the square, and then I folded the long piece in half and made the same little clip in the center of that long piece. What we want to do is we want to shrink this down to fit this. So we're going to adjust the stitch length on our sewing machine. We want to run it all the way up to 5. So that's going to make it pull together easier. We're going to do 2 rows of stitches. So the first row we're going to do right by the edge of the presser foot. So we're going to line the cut edge of the fabric right next to the presser foot. You want to leave a long tail at the beginning and at the end. Then we're going to do a second row of stitches right beside those. So get your threads going out the back of the machine. And I like to line the presser foot up right beside that first row of stitches. So it's right on 5/8. So we're going to do our second row of stitches, keeping them parallel. The whole way down. All right. So we have 2 rows of stitches on this piece. Now we're going to match up the 2 clips that we made. So there's the clip in the small square, and here's the clip in the long piece. So we're going to put a pin there. Pin those together. Now we're going to pull the threads and shrink it down. What you want to be sure you do is pull threads from the same side. So you don't want to do one top thread and one bottom thread. So you want to separate those threads with a pin or your fingers. And I'm going to take the 2 top threads and pull those. So we'll hold those bottom threads out of the way. And we've got the 2 top threads. And you're just going to hold the threads and push the fabric down the thread like so until you get it to where the 2 edges are right on top of each other. So you could just go ahead and put a pin in that right there. And then you can tell right here, oops, right here's where I pinned it, I thought. So you can tell that that's actually pretty good. It shrunk down to fit exactly with the smaller piece. So that's going to slide off if I don't kind of anchor it. So I'm going to take the 2 threads that I was holding and I'm going to wrap them around the pin in kind of a figure 8 or a loop just to hold those in place. All right, then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So I've got my 2 top threads. And because you've made the stitches longer, it pulls easily. There we go. All right. So I'm going to shrink those down like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and pin these two sides together with a pin. And you can see I've got a lot of extra right here, so that tells me that I need to pull some more. So I'm going to grab these two threads and keep pulling and shrink it to where it's flat. So now they're the same length. When you look at this, though, you'll see that there's a gap right here where there's no gather. So it's really tightly gathered, maybe right through here, but right here there's a little gap. So you just want to take your finger or a pin and scratch the gathers so that they're even. So that looks pretty good. There's not any clumps, but there's not any gaps. So that looks good on that side, and then we'll do the same thing on this side. Then I'll put 2 more pins just to kind of hold everything together. I don't want it slipping around. I want to keep those top edges even when I sew the final seam. All right, and now, so this would need to be a 5/8 inch seam, and if you remember when we sewed the second row of stitches, we said it was 5/8. It doesn't necessarily matter. We can pull those threads out, but we're going to line this up on 5/8, and we're going to sew the 2 pieces together. So here we go. We'll do a little back stitch. Oh, one important thing I just remembered. We need to lower the stitch length is on 5, but we need it to be back down on 2.5 so that this will stay together. All right. So I'll line those edges up, and we're just going to sew down through here, keeping our eye on the seam allowance as we go, making sure those edges stay bumped up to each other. Like this. And, all right, got lots of threads that we need to clip. Let's look from the other side and see what we've got. So from this side, all right, so it looked like it's gathered pretty nicely. I do see this row of stitches, and we don't want that. Even if they matched, we wouldn't want to see that gathering thread. So we'll just pull the thread that we were pulling from the beginning, and that should just pull right out. Well, maybe. There we go. And let's see. You may have to use your seam ripper, but you'll pull the basting threads out one way or the other. All right, and I'll show you the finished one is right here. So here's one I did earlier, and you can see that stitched right on top of the basting threads, and from the right side you can't see the blue showing through. You can see that pin, but you can't see the blue. There we go. So that looks good, and those gathers are even. This is one that I wanted to show you that is not a good example. It does have some problems. So if you look at this, you see, oh, there's a huge flat spot right there. So we didn't get the gathers scratched over to the very edge. And then you look right here, and there's like a big clump. So this is not a very good example of how your gathers should look. You wouldn't want it flat and clumped and flat and clumped. And you would want to pull out that row of basting thread. So that is our gathering sample. Okay, we're going to look at a concave curve. And the concave curve you see on a neckline, you see it in an armhole, sometimes you see it in a pocket. So this is the collar to the baby shirt, but we're going to use this side to talk about a concave curve. So I'm going to pin my two sections of fabric together, and we're going to stitch 5/8 of an inch all the way around this curve. So I've got a dark thread on the top so that you can see, and then the white thread on the bottom. But I'm going to line it up, regular stitch length, and we're going to go all the way. So you want to go slow. I'm going too fast. You want to go a little bit slower when you're going around these curves. Just keep your eye on the edge of the fabric and that 5/8 inch line. As you go around, you kind of just drive it with your hands, keeping those two side by side until you get to the end. And then it's great if you'll remember to back stitch. All right. So this is our curve. What you'll notice is if this was the armhole of a sleeve or the armhole of a bodice, and you thought, well, I think I'll just flip this out and it should be good to go. Well, the problem is there is nowhere for this to mold into a curve, and so you would end up with a really bumpy looking armhole or neckline. That would be a problem. What we're going to do to remedy that is we're going to clip and we're going to trim. I think it's easiest if you trim it first. So you'll want to do what we call grading. So you're going to trim away the top seam allowance. You're going to trim in half. So you're going to cut this seam allowance off. This is going to make it not so bulky. Aside from the fact that it'll lay flatter, it won't be so bulky. So we're going to go all the way around the curve, trimming that seam allowance, that top seam allowance in half. All right, so there we have that. Trim off those little threads. All right, then we want to leave this one a little bit longer, maybe not totally the 5/8. So we're going to trim it just slightly longer than the one that we trimmed in half. So you're going to trim off a little bit of that all the way around, like so. All right, so that will make it less bulky for sure, but we still need to make it bendable. These smaller scissors will allow you to not have such a big blade when you're trying to make this little bitty clip. It's kind of hard to control, but if you use your smaller scissors, you have better control and you can get right up next to the stitching line, but not through it. You don't want to cut those stitches. So about every 3/4 of an inch to about every inch is fine to clip. I'm going to clip all the way around that curve, and that's going to let it bend and lay a little smoother. But don't clip those stitches that you just made. All right. Okay, so this should let it lay a little bit smoother. So when we put these two together, as if it were the neckline of a blouse, there, it's going to lay a lot smoother than it did that first time. Of course, this does need to be pressed, and that's what we're going to do next. And then I'm going to show you how to, have you ever seen a blouse or a shirt where the bottom side rolls up and it looks like that? We can stitch the seam allowance to the back side and it will hold it in place, and it'll be a nice neat edge. But let's go to the iron first, and we'll look at the pressing technique, and then we'll come back and do the stitching. So we're at the ironing board. What we want to make sure is that this is perfectly folded in half. So we don't want you don't want it to roll forward like we were looking at earlier, and you want to make sure it's flat so they're not lips is another problem that you can have. So you want to take the point of the iron and just kind of scratch with your fingers, kind of move the fabric down, and then press it with the tip of the iron all the way around, making sure that it's rolled out and smooth. And I think I've got an example of where it can be pressed. It's not, but all right. So we've pressed this nice and smooth, and now we're ready to understitch. But like I say, you want to make sure that those two edges are completely rolled out and right on top of each other. So the last step on the concave curve is to do that row of stitches that's going to hold everything in place. So what we're going to do is we're going to stitch this seam allowance to the back side. So we're going to say that this is the front side that you see when you wear a garment, and then this is the back side, what's next to your skin. So we're going to put the seam allowance to the back side, and then we're going to sew. Oh, look, right there is what I was talking about. So it's not perfectly. So you see how when I went to lay it there, This was folded up. We wanted that to be pulled out tight like it is right there. So I'll make that adjustment right now. Really, I should go back to the ironing board and press, but we'll pull it tight and make it, and then we'll come back and touch it up. So we want to line the seam up with the left side of the presser foot right here. Another thing you can do is on your machine, you can move the needle a little bit closer to make sure. This is one I've already done. You don't want to stitch too far, because remember we trimmed the seam allowance, so we've got to catch it on this side. But you can move your needle over and make sure that you're catching it. So we're going to watch this the crack and that the seam made and the edge of the presser foot when we sew. So we're going to go behind me. We're going to go all the way around this, keeping that seam allowance flat and the collar flat. So from the, up here, so we got some threads to clip, but from the front it looks nice and smooth and everything is to the back. That's supposed to be to the back, and then from the back side you can see that we caught that seam allowance when we did that row of understitches. So you would be good just to trim your threads, and that would be your sample for a concave curve with a graded seam, graded and clipped. Remember, we clipped the seam, made clips, and then we understitched. So you would label this sample the concave curve with a graded seam, a clipped seam, and understitching. So we're going to do the convex curve. So this you would see on the bottom of a pocket, a collar, I'm trying to think of where, so anywhere there's a curve that goes out as opposed to go in. We're going to use the same pattern pieces that we used for the concave curve, but this time we're going to sew on the long curve, on the big curve, instead of the shorter inside curve. So I've pinned my two fabric pieces together, and we're going to sew a 5/8 inch seam all the way around. Again, you want to go slow and keep your eye on that 5/8 inch line on the base of the machine, and keep the edge of the fabric right there lined up with that edge. So I'm going to start sewing. I have these behind. Here we go. Okay. And you want to just go slow and kind of turn the fabric, use both hands, and turn the fabric to keep that edge right there on that line. This is a hard thing to master, and you may need to practice a couple of times to get it just right, but there we go. And right here in this sharp curve. Finish off and back stitch is great. And there's your all right. So if this was our collar, we would want to flip it and put it on the blouse. And let's see what happens if we just go right on without any other steps. What are we going to end up with? Well, we're going to have a bumpy mess. This is what we've got, just similar to what we had with the other curve when we didn't clip or grade. So we've got a big chunky edge. We've got all kinds of lumps, and it's like it's not a smooth curve. So looks a little rough. Let's see what we can do to fix that. So we flip it back out. let's grade this seam just like we did the other seam in the other curve. That's a good first place to start. So separate those seam allowances. Trim that first seam allowance in half. So being careful not to cut the under one yet. So we're going to go all the way around, cutting this. Seam allowance off. Then we're going to trim the longer one. We're going to trim it down just like we did. This will reduce the bulk in the curve, just like in the convex, the concave. So I'm going to trim this down like this. All right, so that will help a little bit. But now when we look on the inside, you'll notice before it was tight and there wasn't, it wouldn't bend out, but now we've got extra, we've got little ripples in there. So to offset those little ripples, we're gonna cut wedges. Before we made clips, but now we're gonna cut wedges. So you can do that in a couple of different ways. Again, this is a time where your little scissors will come in handy, and you're gonna cut little V's out of the curve, so like that. So you can make a snip to the left and a snip to the right, if that's the easiest way for you to do this. Especially in the sharp parts of the curve, like right here on this corner, keeping them kind of close together is a good idea. When you get to the smoother part of this particular curve, you can spread out a little bit more and maybe just do them every couple of inches, like so. Another way you can do it is fold it in half, making sure that you've got the stitching lines lined up, and then you can just clip like that. That's another way to make those little wedges if you don't want to make all the individual little snips. So one more here, and then we'll do a few right here, and then we'll move to the ironing board again to press this and make a finished product. All right. So that should help with the bulk and the ripples, and that already feels better. Now we want to press, and again, this is where it's so important to make sure that this is pressed and pressed out flat, that there aren't little puckers that make what I was calling earlier, referring to as lips. We don't want that. And then we want to make sure that it doesn't roll out, like we don't have the under collar coming out past the front. So let's look at how you can do this on the ironing board. When we come to the ironing board, it's going to be really a challenge to make sure that this fabric is nice because it's got a lot of body to it. So you can use your fingers to make sure that it's all rolled out. If you're using a different fabric that maybe is not so cooperative, sometimes you'll have to use what we call a tailor's ham or a sewing ham. They come in all different sizes. This is a long, skinny one, and it's good for this size of a curve. So you just fit it over the edge of the curve, and then you take the iron and you can press out that flat first. So I'm going to press this flat around the curve. I may have to stop and adjust a couple of times, even pull it tight and kind of work with it. So after I've pressed it flat, then it's going to press, or press it open, then it's going to press flat a little bit easier. So I can line it up now because I've got everything going the way I want it to go, and then come in with that iron and press it really flat. So this looks nice. I don't have any puckers or any lips. And so I'm going to go on around the curve. This flat part, I don't necessarily need the thing. I think I will press this part flat. Another way you can do it is just lay it down flat on the ironing board and use the tip of the iron and pull. And so you can get right in there and kind of pull as you go and get that seam all laid out nice and flat. Like that. And then we'll come back and fold it in half. Roll it just a little bit. And press it flat like that. So, okay, so right here it looks like I'm getting ready to have a big pucker or a set of lips. Don't want that, so I'm going to push it out and use my ham again. And again, pull that over the top of the ham and use the little edge of the nose of the iron to kind of work out all those little bumps and puckers. Get it going the right direction, and then lay it down and go flat like that. Here we go. So this is a great looking collar, one that, yeah, looks nice. It's nice and flat. It's not so bulky, where we trim that out and we have it pressed with everything right where it belongs. So we're going to look at a dart, and when you make a dart, you have to mark where you want it. So this is the sample that we use when we're doing the dart sample. This is the size of the dart that we work. You'll use tracing, pretend like I haven't done this yet, but you'll use tracing paper. This piece has been well loved, but it has a chalky side and a plain side, and you want to put the tracing paper in between your fabric and the pattern. So we'll lay the tracing paper down, and then we'll line up the pattern with the top edge of the fabric. And then this is your tracing wheel, and you will run the notches on the wheel along the line of your dart. So we'll start at the bottom at the dot, and we'll press and roll up the line, putting pretty good pressure on it to make sure it transfers. And then we'll do this other leg of the dart called the dart legs. All right. So when you pull that, voila, there is your dart that you're going to sew. Sometimes if you're using, this shows up really great on a plain solid piece of fabric, but sometimes maybe you're using a piece of fabric that's a print and the tracing paper won't show, or maybe you don't have the right color. So there is another way to mark a dart. What you would do is again, line up your pattern will have the dart. You want to find the tip, and so we would put a pin right here at the tip of the dart. Then we could fold the paper back to where we saw the pin coming through, and we could mark this with a marking pencil. I've got a white one that's going to leave a little mark right there, so we know that's the tip of our dart, that where we're going to end. Then we're going to take our scissors and clip the right and the left dart legs. So we'll make 2 clips on that, and then we'll pull our pattern away, and right here's our the little place where we marked the end of the dart to be, and then we'll find there's 1 clip. So we're going to go from the clip with our ruler down to the mark. We're going to call it right there. We're going to take our chalk or a pencil or a marker, something that shows up. This is not going to be great, but you'll get the idea. And then we'll mark that leg. So I've gone from where that clip was, and I'm making this line with a piece of chalk, and then I'll slide it over. I'll find my other clip and come down on the other side. And again, you'll want to pick some marking tool that shows up on your fabric. But what I've done is the same thing I did with the tracing wheel and tracing paper. I've just used a pencil, and you can kind of see the 2 dart legs and how it ends right there. So that's an option for marking a dart on a really busy piece of fabric, or you can use the tracing paper and tracing wheel like we did on this one. So just like we made the clips at the top of that dart, we want to make clips at the top of this dart. This is going to help us pin the dart so that both of these lines end up right on top of each other. So I'll make a little clip on the right and the left dart legs. All right, and then I'll get 2 or 3 pins, and we'll start by finding the point of the dart, the tip right there, and I'll put a pin right at the very end. So this will help me know when I'm sewing that I'm coming up on the end, and I want to stop there. And then here are my 2 little clips that I made at the top, and that lets me know that I've folded it in half, and both sides should be the same. When you put your pin in this side and you flip over, it should come out on the dot on the other side. So it did right there. And this one doesn't because I pinned it at the tip. So I'm going to put one more pin right in the middle just to make sure it doesn't shift when I'm sewing it. And again, I want to make sure that I go in and I come out on a dot, and I did. And now we're ready to stitch. So we've got it pinned, and now we're ready to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch on this little blue line, and we want to be sure that we finish that last stitch off the edge of the folded edge of the fabric. The other thing you want to remember is you want to always tie the end of the dart off. I'm going to show you 2 different ways to do that. And so we'll start right here with the sewing machine. So we're not going to worry about the 5/8 inch line. We're going to sew on the dotted line. And we want to, we're off center, so we want to move our needle back over to the middle. All right, so we're going to go down. We can back stitch to hold it at the top, and then we're just going to sew over that pin. Pull it out as I go. So I'm sewing right on those dots. All right, and here's my last stitch is actually off in the Never Never Land. All right, the first way to finish this off is to raise the presser foot and pull the fabric towards you up to where you can put your needle down in this little blank space in the V of the dart or the wedge. So we're going to put the presser foot down, and we're going to let the needle go up and down about 3 times in that blank space. So we're going to hold it. We don't want it to take stitches, but we're going to hold it and let it go up and down. And then you see how it just made some little stitches. And that tied off the tip of the dart up in here. So it won't ravel, or it won't pull out. Let me turn this. It won't pull out because we've sewn it off. So it should hold just like that. There's my other dart that I marked earlier. The other thing that you could do, if you forgot to do that, is let's pretend like we forgot, and so, we forgot, but we've got some tails. So what you could do is separate the 2 threads that make the upper and lower, the green one and the white one, and we're just going to tie this 3 times. Tie 3 little knots. Probably should have left a little bit longer tail, but there's one. And oh man. All right, here we go, one more time. This is why you want to remember to do it with the machine, because it's not so, or leave a really long tail. All right, I've done it. No. All right, last try. There we go. All right, so I've tied it off, and then it's not going to pull loose, and I'll just clip my little threads. But the easiest, by far the easiest way, is to remember to do it up here in the blank space of the dart. The last step in the dart is to press it, and that's kind of important, so let's move to the ironing board. The dart is used in construction to go over a curve, so you can tell even just by looking at it that some of the fabric is curving down and some is flat. You see it in the bust, you see it in the back of the shoulder, you see it at the waistline and the hips. But when we press it, we want to make sure that it's pressed and the fabric is molded into a curve. So again, we're going to use a tailor's hand. This is the bigger one. And you're going to lay the fabric on the hand so that it smooths out over the curve. And then you're able to press that dart flat. So I've got it right here on the end. And then I'm just, again, going to use the nose of the iron and kind of tug and make sure that all that is laying flat and smooth under the fabric on the back side. And then I've got my dart, and it's got that little curve to it that you can see that would go over whatever curve of the body. We just looked at 6 construction techniques that you'll be doing. In the next video, we'll look at 3 seams that you will be doing sample